So, dear jury, dear guests, my name is Oleksandr, and today I will present to you my PhD thesis, which is titled The Data Mining-Based Tools to Support Library Update. So this was a CIFR PhD that I did between the Arola software company and Inria research lab. So from the side of Arola, my advisor was Arnaud THIEFAINE, who is hopefully with us today online, or he will join shortly. And from Inria, my supervisors were Stéphane DUCASSE and Nicolas ANQUETIL. I want to start by saying a few words about Arola. So this is a consulting company that is specialized in the advanced techniques of software development, such as clean code, TDD, BDD, and legacy remediation. And here you can see the website of Arola, and if you go there, you will see those kind of very colorful pictures, because this is the identity of Arola. So like this, I will have also those pictures in my presentations, so because I share their template. So I would like also to begin by saying my big thank you to Arola for sponsoring my research during those 3 years and for providing me with amazing guidance and for their amazing feedback, especially to Arnaud, who was my advisor. Now I will begin my presentation, and I will start by introducing the library update problem, which was the central problem of my thesis. So here you can see a picture that demonstrates how a client system that can be any application, for example, a smartphone app or a website or anything that you develop, depends on an external library. Now, client application is developed by some client developer, and external library is developed by library developer. However, as any software, libraries also have to evolve. So over time, a library releases a new version. And theoretically, we expect that the new version will be compatible with the previous ones. However, in practice, it often does not happen. In practice, library developers introduce breaking changes, and those are the kind of changes that break compatibility with previous versions. So when this happens, when clients try to use the new version, their software breaks, they receive many errors. And what they need to do is to update their system. So clients need to update system in response to the library evolution, and this process is known as the library update. So the main question of library update is how we can change the client code to use the new version of the library. And my thesis is about helping developers in this process by building tools. I would like to make a disambiguation between two terms that are often used in the literature interchangeably. So first is library update, and the second one is library migration. Library update is the process when you change one library to the next version of the same library. And library migration is when you change one library with another completely different library that although can be similar. So for example, when you replace Struts 1.0 with Struts 1.2, this is library update. And when you replace EasyMock with Mockito, this is library migration. So my work was about library update. However, I also considered some literature on library migration because these problems are closely related. And here you can see a small motivating example. So here a client developer is using external library AI-lib version 1. And client developer writes a simple machine learning code to predict a salary of a given employee. So here in the first line, client developer imports the linear regression class. Then they import the read data function. Then they use this function to read the data from a CSV file. Then clients create a model. They use this model to train the data, to train the model on the data. And then they use the model to predict the salary. However, after some time, the new version of the library is released. And then the client code breaks with the following 3 errors. So first, linear regression was not found. Second, read data was not found. And third, the predict function received wrong arguments. So this information is not sufficient for clients to know what was going on and to know how to fix their code. However, in the story, there's also a library developer. And library developer possesses the information. So they know that, for example, linear regression was renamed to AI linear regression. Read data was changed in such a way that this function is now more specific, and it was replaced with read CSV. And predict was changed that instead of accepting one row, it now accepts the whole collection of inputs. So now library developer can communicate this information to the client developer, and our goal is to help them make this communication more efficient. I approach this problem from 3 different aspects. So the empirical aspect, where I try to understand how library update happens in practice, what problems do developers face, and what support do they need. The language aspect, when we want to understand how can we propose the language for code transformations, and the automation aspect, when we want to know how to automatically discover transformations. In my work during my thesis, I focused on Pharo programming language, which is a pure object-oriented dynamically typed language. And we chose it because first, through our team, through our mod, we have access to the core developers of Pharo and to a big portion of Pharo community, which allowed us to validate our experiments, which allowed us to communicate with people, to collect a lot of expertise. And also because Pharo is very convenient for manipulating source code. So it allows us to easily parse the code, to easily access the commit history, to easily analyze the commit history. And the rest of my presentation will be structured in the following way. So after the introduction, I will discuss state of the art, and then I will present three main parts of my research. So first, the survey of developers for library update, then the prewriter, the smart deprecation rewriting in Pharo, and then the minor, the novel approach to recommend transformation rules. Finally, I will present the conclusion and the directions of the future work. I begin the review of state of the art by looking at the empirical studies, and I classify them by the following two criteria. First, I look at the technique and then perspective. So from technique point of view, we classify studies into developer surveys and code analysis. From perspective, we look if authors consider the perspective of client developers, of library developers, or both those perspectives. So here you can see the related studies that we considered, the related empirical studies of library update. As you can see, most of them perform code analysis, and only few of them perform the developer survey. What's more interesting is that those developer survey, they only target specific cases of breaking changes. So they only identify breaking change, and then they only ask developers why does breaking change happen or what should be done about it. On the other hand, you can also see that most surveys, they focus on client developers and only few, well, relatively few focus on library developers. So in our work, we identified the following two shortcomings that we are addressing in our research. First, as I said, most surveys, they analyze specific cases of breaking changes. And on the contrary, we want to ask general questions about experience, about expectations, about the type of support that developers need. And second, it is another shortcoming is that no survey that you know of has asked client developers about the specific type of support that they expect, about what makes a library update hard and what makes it easy. Another part of literature overview is about tools to support library update. So I classify it by four criteria. First, the problem, then perspective. So for example, problem is the problem of library update or library migration, as I discussed before. The perspective, again, is either perspective of client developers or perspective of library developers or both. Then I also classify it by the sources of information and technique. So sources of information, since it's a recommendation tool, I ask a question, where does the data come from? So based on what does this approach make recommendations? And it can be either based on the expertise of developers or documentation or history or the two versions of source code. And all those things, they can come from three sources. It can be either the library itself, or the client systems that were already updated, or the unit tests, which can also be considered as kind of client systems. Finally, the technique. So the approach can be either using the textual similarity. So for example, comparing two pieces of source code and using some string metrics to understand how similar they are, or structural similarity. For example, comparing the abstract syntax trees, or the call dependency. So analyzing the dependencies between different source artifacts. These are also the studies that are related to the tools to support library update. And as you can see here, most studies, they focus on client developers. Only two first studies, they provided tools for library developers. And those studies, they did not provide tools that can automatically infer rules. They depended on the expertise of those developers and only allowed them to encode the rules that developers already know. Also here you can see the additional column, the dynamic rewriting. So the important thing for us is also that almost no study is focused on dynamically typed languages. And the rules the studies propose, they're expected to be applied statically to the entire project. And only under HORA, only one work considered the context of dynamic language and considered applying rules in the dynamic context. So the three shortcomings of those studies that we will also be addressing is first, no studies propose automated tools to support library developers. Second, most studies do not consider dynamic rewriting. And third, most studies focus on statically typed programming languages. Now I will go to the first part of my research when I will describe the empirical aspect. So this will be the developer survey of our library update. And those results, they were published in the Asian Pacific Software Engineering Conference. So here you can see the picture that I already showed you before. And here we take a look at those two developers. So we want to understand their experience. We want to understand how do they behave in the context of library update, what problems do they face, and what support do they need. So to do that, we have collected the population of developers from an open source community and from two industrial companies. We split them into groups, the library developers and the client developers, and we gave them the survey with questions. So we tried to understand what are their experiences. In this presentation, I will present only some selected findings that I find interesting, and the rest of my survey can be found inside my thesis. So one question that we asked to client developers that was particularly interesting for us is how often do they face the problem of library update? So how often do they have to update their dependencies? And unexpectedly for us, we didn't expect that it would be so often. They deal with this problem 3 times a year or more often. So these are 17 developers out of 36, and 27 out of 36 deal with it twice a year or more often. So this shows that this problem is really often appearing in the lifestyle of ordinary developers. On the other hand, we also asked client developers what makes library update easy and what makes it hard. So this was an open question that would help us understand what kind of support they can expect from library developers. And as you can see, most client developers selected documentation and the absence of breaking changes. And here they selected breaking changes and the absence of documentation. So this means that, for example, if the documentation is good and there are few breaking changes, library update is easy. And if documentation is absent or missing and there's a lot of breaking changes, library update is hard. So these two factors are the main to consider when we want to provide support for clients. Then we ask questions to the library developers. So first, what is the impact of breaking changes on their clients according to their perception? And as you can see here, most developers answered that it is either moderate, big, or very big. Only one library developer considers that the impact is very small. So this shows that library developers are aware that breaking changes are affecting their clients, and they might want to do something about that. Then we will also ask library developers if it's important for them to encourage their clients to update. And as you can see here, well, those last two rows, those are the 66% of developers. So majority of developers consider that it's very important or absolutely essential. So like this, we have the conclusions of our survey, which provide the empirical basis for the rest of my work. So we know that client developers, they often have to deal with the problem of library update. We know that they need support from library developers in the form of documentation and some kind of support to deal with breaking changes. And on the side of library developers, we know that they want to help their clients to update. And like this, from our side, we can provide tools for library developers who will in turn help their clients. And now we come to the second part of my research, which is the language aspect. So it was the study of the prewriter, the on-the-fly rewriting of method deprecations in Pharo. And the results of the study were published in the Journal of Object Technologies. So here on the slide, you can see the example of the method deprecation in Pharo. The first line is the method signature. The second line is the deprecation. And the third line is the method body, where we call the new method. As you can look at the deprecation, this part, the green part, it is the deprecation message. So it is a string that will be displayed to the client in a warning when client calls the deprecated message. And we expect the string to describe in a meaningful way, for example, why the method is deprecated and what should be used instead. Here is a new way of deprecating methods in Pharo. And this way allows you to introduce also transformation rules. So you provide deprecation message and the rule. Now this rule will be used to automatically update the client system. We can take a closer look at this rule. So the rule consists of two parts. There is a left-hand side and the right-hand side. So the left-hand side is the kind of regular expression that matches the method calls in the client system that should be replaced. And the right-hand side defines the replacement. So it's important also to see that this part is the variable. So this variable can match any kind of source code that is followed by is special, and the same kind of source code that is followed by needs full definition. So this will be, for example, the receiver of the message. We can also express pretty complex rules with this language. So for example, here you can see that we can replace the method call with a complex structure like this, where you have one method, another method, then a block, and inside another method and another method. So like this, the language allows us to provide a complex replacement for different complex scenarios. And this is the example of how rewriting happens in action. So first, on the side of library developers, they only have to introduce the deprecation. So they take a method and they deprecate it, providing the explanation why the method is deprecated and the transformation rule. On the other side, the client developers, they only have to write their code. So the only thing they have to do is to invoke the deprecated method, and then the rest will happen automatically. So as the method is invoked, as client calls the deprecated method, the warning is signaled. And then the deprecator comes into action, and the tool walks the call stack and finds the specific method call in the client system and dynamically rewrites it using this rule that was provided by the library developer. Then finally, on the step 5, the execution continues. And like this, the execution doesn't stop. So whatever application was running, it will continue running. Now, there are also some client developers who do not want their tool to be rewritten on the fly without them knowing. So like this, they have the power on this step. They can say that, okay, I want to validate every rule that will change my code. I want to say yes or no. Do I accept it or do I reject it? So they also have this possibility. We also analyzed the existing deprecations in Pharo 8 because we wanted to understand how the community adopts them. So as you can see here, out of 367 deprecations, 59%, they contain the transformation rules. So it means that the deprecator rule, it is actively being used by the community. 41%, they're what we call the non-rewriting deprecations. They do not have transformation rules. And we were particularly interested in those ones because we want to know why they do not have them. So maybe those are complex cases that would help us understand how to improve the language and how to improve the deprecator. Maybe those are the cases that library developers did not know how to use the tool. So maybe they need some support from another tool to generate those rules. Maybe they didn't want to deprecate at all. So maybe this was a special case when deprecation is not like they deprecated, but they didn't want to transform. There is no replacement. So we manually analyzed all those rules. We manually classified them in multiple categories. We extracted the ones that were invalid, submitted pull requests in Pharo. But what is interesting that we saw that 9% of rules, they're what we call the obvious opportunity. So this means that we can generate them automatically, or developer can introduce them automatically without having any kind of knowledge about the system. So those rules, they mean that if they were not introduced, it is simply because the developer either didn't know how to use the deprecator, or didn't have time, or didn't know what is the or didn't know what is the correct replacement. So the similar study was done in other programming languages, and also the similar logic can be applied to other languages. As you can see in Java, C#, and JavaScript, 33% for Java, 22% for C#, and 33% for JavaScript of the deprecations, they do not have any helpful replacement messages. So what it means that neither in the deprecation string, nor in comment, nor anywhere else, there is no description of why the method is deprecated and what clients can do to replace it. And this means that client developers are left completely without support in those cases. And those great parts, they're good because they're the places for improvement. This is where we can introduce our tools to help library developers write better deprecations and better document them. So the main contributions of our deprecator study are the first documentation of the deprecator approach. We also introduced the validity criteria for the transformation rules and detected, for example, 8 invalid rules in Pharo. And we submitted them as PR and they were merged. So we also improved Pharo on that side. We also analyzed the non-rewriting deprecations in Pharo 8. And we made a survey of developers who use the deprecator to understand what is their experience, how easy do they find it, and so on. Now we come to the third part, the automation aspect. So this is the third study that I performed during my thesis. This is the novel approach that minor to infer transformation rules from the commit history. And the result of the study were published in the International Conference of Software Reviews this year. So here you can see the process of using the deprecator. The idea is that the library developer creates rules, writes them to the deprecations, and then the tool updates the clients automatically. The problem is that library developers are expected to know how to write the rules. They're expected to know what is the replacement for the deprecated message. Sometimes it is possible, but there are also cases when this is not the case, especially in large open source projects with many developers. In those cases, for example, there are many library developers who change code at the same time, and they may not be aware of all the breaking changes there are in the system. Then when the deprecation is introduced, sometimes developer cannot know why the method was removed, how to replace it. And like this, they may benefit from the tool that would look at the commit history, extract the knowledge from there, generate the rules, and propose them to the library developer, so that library developer can combine their own expertise with the recommendations of the tool and provide better rules for the writer. The first step of our approach is to detect breaking changes. And now there are many ways to define breaking changes, but for us, we look at one particular case. We look at the case of the missing methods. So we represent the old API and the new API as two sets of methods. And we find the difference between them. So for us, the missing methods are the methods that existed in the old API, but no longer exist in the new one. So it is this colored green part. Those are the missing methods. And our goal is to find replacement for these methods in the system and to recommend to reintroduce them with the deprecation. And here comes the first challenge, because in Faro there is no method visibility. So basically, as far as Faro is concerned, every method is public. However, of course, in the project, library developers do not intend their clients to use every single method. Some methods are only meant to be used internally by the library. So to deal with the challenge, we define a language-specific heuristics based on the conventions used by the Faro community, based on certain techniques that developers use and certain practices that they have. And we created this little open source tool that can be used in similar research to define what is the API of the project and what are the methods that need to be supported and maintained. The second step is data representation. So we have collected all the commits between given two versions of the system, so the old version and the new version. Between every two subsequent pair of commits, we calculated the diffs. And then, as you can see on this side, those are the typical line-based diffs that you get from every version control system, for example, Git. So you can see that it shows you the removed lines and added lines. However, this information is not sufficient to make meaningful analysis. So what we want some kind of high-level representation where for each commit we can know what were the removed methods, what were the added methods, and what were the modified methods. And most importantly, we want to know what were the removed method calls and added method calls. Now in Faro, there is a tool called Iceberg, which we could use that allows us to do just that. So we can have a very high-level representation of the commit history, and we can analyze it, we can work with it. So the third step is recommendation of the rules. And for that, we perform the market basket analysis. This is a very common technique that is used by retailers, for example, by supermarkets, to know which products to put together on the shelves or which products to advertise to you. Here you can see an example where 5 customers are buying different sets of products. So you can imagine that it's every customer having a basket in the supermarket and buying some products. Now, the supermarket wants to learn those two questions. First, what are the products that are frequently purchased together? We call them frequent item sets. And second, what can we recommend to people who buy some specific product, for example, bread? We call this association rules. Now, as you can see here, after simple analysis that can be performed by algorithms such as a priori, eclat, or fpgrows, we can find that 60% of clients, they buy bread and butter together, and also 60% they buy milk and cereal together. So those are the 2 frequent item sets. Also, we can see that 4 customers buy bread, and of them 3 also buy butter. So from this, we can infer that with confidence 75%, we can recommend butter to everyone who buys bread. Now, we can apply the same idea to the source code, because we can represent every method that is changed by every commit as a transaction, as a set of removed and added method calls. And we can ask the same 2 questions. So what are the operations of removal and additions that commonly happen together? Those are, we call them the frequent method call replacements. And from that, we can directly infer the rules of this kind. So we can know what can we recommend as a replacement for the method that was removed. So for example, for method next with confidence 75%, we can recommend next node. And this is exactly what we want to recommend replacement for the missing methods. So given the missing methods that we found on step 1, and given the association rules that we have in mind just now, we can generate the deprecations like this. It would have the replacement message explaining that which method should be used instead. And it will also have the transformation rule like this. And finally, in the last line, it will call the new method. The important thing to understand here is that those methods, they were removed, so they were missing. Now, what we propose to library developers is to reintroduce the method that was removed as a deprecated method. So like this, they can increase the consistency with the previous version. Here comes the second challenge, because in Pharo, it is a dynamically typed programming language, so we do not have static type information. So this means that for the rules, we cannot know if the methods, if the method names, they come from the same class. We do not know from which class do they come. So to deal with this challenge and to have meaningful recommendations, we filter the association rules, and we only retain the ones where the right-hand side and the left-hand side belong to the same class in the new version of the project. So like this, we can have the meaningful recommendation in the context of the dynamically typed language. We have implemented our approach in a prototype tool for Pharo with the user interface like that. And it allowed library developers to take their project from the version control system, to specify 2 versions, and to specify the confidence and support thresholds. With some trial and error, they can choose those thresholds, but for us, for our project, we had our own way of choosing them. So then they can see the old version of the system, the new version of the system, and the list of recommendations. And here they can browse every recommendation. It will generate them the deprecation, and then they can accept or reject this deprecation. So if they accept it, it will be installed into their system, and then they can commit it using the version control. To validate our approach, we have selected several open source projects from the Pharo ecosystem. So these projects are very diverse. So you can see that the size of each bubble, it represents the size of the project by the number of methods in it. The color represents the type of the project. So for example, Pharo is very big, data frame is the most small of them. And by the type, there are tools, libraries, and SDKs. Now, tool is the kind of project like a smartphone application. It is meant to be used by the end users, by ordinary people. And those tools, the main part of the tool is not the API of the system that should be used by developers, but rather the interface. Library, on the contrary, the main part of the library is the API. Because other developers will be using this API. So like this, the APIs of the library, they are much more volatile and they're much more advanced than the APIs of the tools. And finally, Pharo is the special kind of the project, which we call the SDK, because it combines in itself many tools and many libraries. So we put it in a separate column. Finally, the number of people next to each project is the number of reviewers that we chose from the core team to validate our recommendations. As you can see, for all the projects, we chose 1 reviewer from the core team, but from Pharo, we chose 4 different reviewers, because Pharo has very different projects and very different domains. And like this, we chose reviewers with different expertise. Here you can see the results of our recommendations. So inside each circle, you can see the number of deprecations that we could generate for each project. And the green part is the number of generated deprecations that were accepted by the developers. So as you can see, now you have to consider that deprecations, sometimes they're not possible to, because sometimes deprecations should simply not have replacement, and sometimes it is even hard for humans to introduce them. So like this, for Pharo, we have more than 60% of deprecations that were accepted, and these are 61 deprecations that were accepted as pull requests into the system. For Famix, it was even more. So you can see a lot of deprecations that were accepted by the developer. And for data frame, they accepted 4 deprecations. Now, the light green part is the deprecations that are not rewriting, so they do not contain the transformation rule. And the dark green part, they contain the transformation rule. Now, if you look at the bottom projects, you can see that for them, we could not generate so many recommendations. And for Moose, we generated some, but most of them were not accepted. Now, additional studies are required to explain this phenomenon, why there is a difference between those projects. But we have a hypothesis that it is because of the type of the project. As I showed you in the previous slide, those projects have different type. And for example, those projects, they're libraries. This one is SDK, and those are the tools. So we hypothesize that the tools, they don't have the API that changes so much through the commit history. And despite the fact that, for example, DataFrame is a very small project that doesn't have such a big commit history, while Moose and Pillar, they have much bigger commit history, much more diverse, and like this, we could cut more data. However, through this commit history, the API is not affected so much. And like this, we cannot learn so much of the changes. But this is a hypothesis that can be validated in the future work. Then we also identified 3 limitations of the depminer. First, it proposes the simplified recommendations. So it makes a naive assumption the developer always wants to deprecate. And during our experiment, we noticed that sometimes we propose a recommendation, it is correct, but developers do not want to accept because they say, I do not want to introduce deprecation into my system in this case. Then depminer, it is based on the self-usage of the library. So like this, if the methods are unused or untested, then it will not be effective. So for example, if there are some methods that are not covered by unit tests, or if there are some methods that are only meant for external users and not used inside the library, depminer will not be effective for detecting the change in this kind of method. And the third limitation is that, like every other approach in the related work that we found, depminer makes the kind of naive search. To find the effect of a breaking change that happened in one specific commit, it searches through the entire commit history between 2 versions. Now we have the hypothesis that it might be effective in the future work to look in the local subset. So to identify where the breaking change happened and to look locally in this locality in the neighboring commits to find the effect of the breaking change. Now, finally, to overcome the limitation 1, we did some preliminary study, and by talking to the developers, in the community and to the ones that took part in our survey, we have identified 6 possible responses to the breaking changes from the side of library developers. So as you can see on the left, we split the table by either the developers want to deprecate or not. Then we split it if the replacement exists, and if it does exist, is it automatable or not? And as you can see in the right, in depminer, we only focused on this part. So if the deprecation is, if developers want to deprecate, if replacement exists, and it is automated. And we also considered actually this part, that developers want to deprecate, but replacement is not automatable, because we also showed developers the message about the replacement, but without generating the exact transformation rule. However, in the future studies, we should also consider the following, because actually it is possible that developers do not want to deprecate. It is possible that we might want to generate documentation. It is also possible that we generate the library update script that can be sent to clients and automatically applied to their code. So this is another small preliminary study that we did. We proposed this kind of 6 possible responses that library developers can have, except only introducing deprecations with transformation rules. Finally, I present the conclusions and the future work. So first, the contributions to my study. From the empirical part, I have performed the developer survey to understand the practices of library update. From the language part, we did a first documentation of the depwriter approach and the study of its adoption by the community. And from the automation part, we proposed a novel depminer approach to mine the transformation rules from the commit history and the generalization of depminer as a holistic approach. Now, the first direction of the future work is to improve depminer based on the limitation that I mentioned before. So as I said before, for the limitation 1, we can use the table that we proposed to consider other actions that only deprecate. So we can see also that we can provide documentation, or we can provide the list of breaking changes, or we can provide the library update script. For the second limitation, we can, to overcome the fact that depminer is dependent of library self-usage of itself, we can combine depminer approach with the existing approaches to detect refactorings, because those approaches, they are not dependent or whether or not the library is calling its own methods. And finally, for the third limitation, we can perform this kind of local search in the commit history to identify first the commit that was removing the method, and then looking for the neighboring commits to find the effect of this breaking change. The other direction of the future work are the challenging cases. So as any other study of library update that we found in the literature, our study focused on the method-to-method mapping. So we imagined this problem, as I showed you before, we look at the old API as a set of methods, the new API as a set of methods, and we try to map the methods. So to map methods from the old API to the methods to the new API. And we recommend this kind of mappings to the library developers. However, as we did our experiments, we noticed that although this kind of model covers most of the cases of breaking changes, there are also situations that are more complex. There are also situations that require a different model. And like this, in the final chapter of my thesis, I have collected and documented, by talking to the community, I have collected and documented 5 challenging scenarios. So reassigning the existing name, circular renaming, modifying abstract hooks, cleaning up spurious objects, and the case when string literals are used as identifiers. Now, those are the 7 publications that I did during my thesis. 2 of them are journal papers, 3 of them are conference papers. There were also 2 workshop papers and 1 technical report. I received 1 Best Postpaper award at GPR-GPL and the 2nd Best Paper award recently at IWST. Now, this concludes my presentation. I thank you very much for your attention, and I will be happy to answer your questions.